Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today in Prague at the VHU, the Czech Military Technical Institute, and we are taking a look at a number of really cool experimental Czech firearms in their reference collection. This is part of the institute is the Czech Military Museum. Specifically today, we're taking a look at the VZ-38. This is the first submachine gun that was officially adopted into Czech military service, but like many other early submachine gun designs from the late 1930s, it was developed, it was tested, it was adopted, and it never actually went into production. So we have a chance here today to take a look at one of the very few surviving examples. Now, this was developed at Strakonice at the CZ factory. They later moved to Uherský Brod, where they are today, but originally from Strakonice. And the designer here was one of There's a small batch of Czech firearms designers whose names will come up over and over again in the 1920s and 1930s. In this case, the designer was one František Myška. Now, he had been very interested in submachine guns from the very early 1930s, but the Czech military didn't have an interest until, well, they started this program in 1935. Now, Myška had been looking into other foreign submachine gun designs. He narrowly missed a chance to see a testing of the Finnish Suomi here in Czechoslovakia in 1934, but got some notes on it, and you'll see how that becomes relevant again in a few minutes when we take this apart. But finally in 1935, the Czech government decides that there is a value to submachine guns. But unlike many other countries where they see the submachine gun being useful is in fortifications. The idea of a submachine gun as a light caliber replacement for a typical machine gun in a fortification. Like, we need to prevent the enemy from closing in and physically assaulting the fortification. We can do that with small caliber submachine guns, perhaps better than we could do it with guns like the VZ-26 light machine gun. And so that was the original design concept for this guy. Now, the first iterations were ready in 1936. They're distinctive because they actually have a vertical front grip. They were tested in 9mm parabellum, but also in 9x17mm. Now, at this point, the Czech military's standard sidearm was the VZ-22, later became the VZ-24, and then the VZ-27, which you'll see around. They're not that uncommon today, but they were chambered for essentially an up-powered version of 380 auto. So it's 9x17mm, but it was a cartridge, the VZ-22, the model 1922 cartridge, that was about 20% more powerful than what we think of today as 380 ACP. And so when this submachine gun was developed for the military, while they did develop a version, test a version in the German military cartridge, which was 9x19, what the Czech government ultimately adopted was the version in 380 because that was the cartridge they were already using in handguns. So kind of makes sense. Not a lot of countries had a 9x17 submachine gun, so this is kind of cool in that regard. At any rate, first testing was done in 1936. They go back, make some changes. This is the 1938 pattern. It was tested formally in August of 1938. Specifically, they tested it against the VZ-26 light machine guns, which may be one of the very few formal military trials that I can think of where they were actually testing a light machine gun against a submachine gun for the exact same role, for essentially fortress fire suppression sort of utility. At any rate, it did quite well. It was formally adopted or recommended for adoption in August of 38, and they go to start tooling up for it. And we'll talk about what actually happened with it in a minute, but first, let's go ahead and take it apart. It's a beautifully made gun with a couple unique features to it. In general, what we have here is a pretty simple open bolt blowback submachine gun. But let's start with a quick look at the receiver markings. We don't actually have a model designation here. This is just a company mark. It's Česká Zbrojovka, which is the company name today, that is CZ. And then this is essentially incorporated in Prague. It wasn't actually located in Prague, but that was the formal company name. And then the serial number for this example, number 10. I think the most distinctive feature here is probably that magazine, so we'll go to this next. To remove it, we just pull this lever back, and then the magazine slides out of a set of big sort of trapezoidal magazine receptacle walls. They did make a stick magazine, or a box magazine for the gun. It held 24 rounds. The drum magazine, however, held a whopping 96, which is quite impressive. Looking at this, it is a pretty short magazine front to back, and that's because it is chambered for that 380 or 9x17 millimeter cartridge. Now, I mentioned earlier that Myška, the designer, got some notes on a Finnish Suomi submachine gun demonstration, and his notes definitely included a detailed explanation of the magazine, because this is absolutely and positively a blatant copy of the Finnish Suomi magazine, just holding 96 rounds instead of a mere 71. So the way this works, you put the cartridges in, base down, bullets pointing forward. You would wind this up all the way around and then load all the rounds. And then I'm going to unwind this now rather than leave it sprung. Normally what would happen is you then put the magazine cover back on, line it up there, put that in, and then when you push this button on the back, that's going to release tension on the spring, so it's going to, well, it's going to put tension on the whole stack of cartridges, and you can then drop this locking plate up there, which holds the magazine catch, or the spring catch out, so this is going to continuously feed and locks the front cover on the magazine. Note on the back here we have these two guide wings to help you center the magazine on this rear magazine support. Moving from front to back, we have a number of features here. First off, these two ribs, this is actually the mounting point to set the gun up in one of the Czech fortifications. They had sort of a universal gun mounting system that would take ZB-26s, among other things, and the VZ-24 here was designed to fit into that system. So that's what these are. The sights, we have a big barleycorn style front sight, windage adjustable, and then very much a rifle style V-notch rear sight, adjustable from 50 out to 300 meters in 50 meter increments. So a pretty reasonable expectation of maximum effective range of, it's even up powered, it's still essentially a 380 caliber submachine gun. There is no manual safety or fire selector. This is full auto only, and the safety mechanism is simply this notch. So if you want to keep the gun safe, you lock the charging handle up into that capture notch, and then of course nothing can happen. It does fire from an open bolt, so that's the position where the bolt's locked open, ready to fire, and then when you pull the trigger, the bolts kind of drop and just cycle as long as you hold the trigger down. It is worth pointing out that there is no anti-bounce sort of mechanism here, so if this gun were dropped on the buttstock, it is very possible for the bolt to bounce back far enough to pick up a cartridge and then pop it forward and fire it, because this does have a fixed firing pin. It has to come all the way back to there to actually lock open. So this is a fairly common shortcoming of the early 1930s submachine gun designs. Before they, basically once these sort of guns got into service, people started having the occasional accidental discharge jumping out of the back of trucks or dropping guns. And that's when they started adding locking mechanisms. So you see that the first generation of the Sten guns, the first generation of MP38, had exactly this same shortcoming. Had this gone into service, I'm sure they would have added something like a push-through charging handle or a locking mechanism here to prevent that issue. The sling swivel is a fully 360 rotating, folding swivel here on the barrel, but then the rear sling attachment is a cavalry-style bar on the wrist of the gun. This does make it a little bit uncomfortable to shoulder left-handed, definitely a gun intended for right-handed use. And then we have the cleaning rod spring-loaded into the back of the stock, so kind of an interesting place to put it there. And this doubles as a disassembly tool. So taking a cue from the early Bergmann Schmeisser machine guns, there's a pivot point right here, and to disassemble this we need to push this. This is the spring, mainspring guide rod. We have to push that in, and then the gun, the action can pivot up. And I use the cleaning rod to do that. Push it in there, and then presto, the gun opens. We have a rotating rear cap here. That's going to come off. You can see there's a set of interrupted threads there. It is a non-captive recoil spring. This particular one has taken a set. Just dry handling it, you can tell that the spring's definitely too weak for this gun to run reliably, and I suspect that's because this went through extensive shooting testing, and then it probably sat cocked for like 40 years at some point. But that's how that works. Notice we have a little serial number 10 there on the rear end cap. So once that is removed, then we can pull the bolt back. Once it gets back to here, to disassemble it, it drops down, and when the receiver is locked in the stock, that slot is below the level of the wood, which prevents the bolt from ever coming out. Very simple weighted bolt, just simple blowback design, fixed firing pin. We have an extractor there. You have your sear catch back here. The charging handle only goes halfway in because the recoil spring is in there, and then there's, looks like a peened off screw that just holds the charging handle in place, so that the handle itself is not regularly removable. Serial number 10 on the bolt as well. Now, if we just pull that screw out, we can take off the stock. And there we go. Just one screw. And just have a lug there. And a metal block inside the stock. The fire control mechanism is very simple because it's full auto only. You pull the trigger down, it drops the sear. That's all there is to it. And then lastly, the barrel is actually pretty easily removable. So we've got this octagonal nut, and I can just unscrew this. In service, you would probably want it a little bit tighter than it is here. Once this comes off, you can see we have a locating pin right there, and this is tight, but there we go. Can remove the barrel. Now, it seems to me the easily detachable barrel may very well have come from sort of the theory of like a light machine gun theory, the idea of using this in a fortification where, you know, you may be shooting very high volumes of ammo and you want to be able to swap the barrel out like you can on a ZB-26. However, that's not actually substantiated in any of the documentation around these guns, so that's basically my conjecture only. You know, early guns like this often had a number of features that, you know, the designer wasn't sure. What is the military going to want? What are they not going to care about? The detachable barrel ends up in the production, pre-production prototypes here. You know, also very possible had this gone into production, this could have been abandoned as, you know, we can make the gun cheaper if we just fix the barrel in place and do away with this. But there you have a fully field-stripped Czech VZ-38 pre-production submachine gun. In total, only 20 of these were actually manufactured. They were essentially the 20 pre-production prototypes to be proved out, make sure everything's ready to make a final full production line at CZ to put the gun into full military service. And then the Germans showed up. So in March of 1939, Germany occupies Czechoslovakia. Production on this pretty well ends. Even before that, when Germany occupied the Sudetenland, that involved a lot of the Czech fortifications where these guns actually would have been used. So even if there had been guns in production by spring of 39, they probably wouldn't have been able to be used for their intended purpose anyway. Now, I will say it's interesting to me that I think kind of like the M1 carbine in US service was developed for truck drivers and artillery crewmen and machine gunner, well, not machine gunners, but like mortar crews. It was supposed to be a supplemental personal weapon, but the moment regular infantrymen got their hands on M1 carbines, they loved them for the lightweight and the handiness, and they very quickly found their way into frontline infantry use. I have no doubt that this would have been the same way had it gotten into mass production and service. Yeah, it was intended for fortification use, but you know that the moment the infantry managed to scrounge some of these things out of fortifications, they would immediately have been saying, like, yes, we want more of these. Like, enough bolt-action rifles, give us submachine guns like this, especially with the magazine capacity that this had. So had it been like a year earlier, there would have been some potential for this to have played a much more substantial role in the war. Now, as it was, When the Germans occupied Czechoslovakia, a lot of the Czech firearms designs were taken into German military service, in particular, service of the SS. The SS was outside the standard Wehrmacht military supply chain. They were kind of the second priority, and so the army was taking all the production of standard German small arms. The SS had to go find other factories that didn't have Wehrmacht contracts, and so a lot of the very fine Czech weapons ended up in SS service. This did not, probably because it was chambered for 9x17. So yes, they had a 9x19 experimental version. It had no significant tooling ready in the spring of 1939. This did have at least some, but this would not have fit into any sort of standard German logistics. The guns, the Czech guns that the Germans did take were the ones chambered for 9x19, 7.92 Mauser, the standard German military cartridges. And so, for that reason, this gun pretty much just ends in 1939 when the Germans show up. So very cool to get a chance to take a look at this, one of very few surviving examples. Here at the VHU, specifically at the Army Museum attached to the VHU, they have not just one of these, but they also have one of the very first versions on display in the museum, along with a tremendous display of other firearms, in particular, a whole bunch of Czech experimental guns. So it's a very cool museum to take a look at if you're into small arms history. If you're here in Prague, it's right in Prague, and a very easy stop, and definitely worth several hours of your time to check out. So, big thanks to them for access to film. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.